Hey guys, it's Tiny Tom Logan back with another video for you. It's time for the Taichi. So our first quick look at the board, and I'm going to show you it built because let's face it, there's been a lot of reviews on this and it's not exactly the newest board in the world. So I'm just going to go around kind of bullet points for you. And they are going to be kind of highlights rather than the full package. But the biggest selling point for this board is the fact that we've got 16 power phases around the outside of the CPU. They say that's 12 for the actual CPU and then 4 for the SoC. Nice, lots of clean power. That could mean better overclocks. We'll have to see later on in the review. It could just mean that you're going to get much cooler temperatures around the socket and lower the board temperatures. But again, we will talk about that later on in the review. We do have the I/O cover at the back. You do get a big gap around the back of the I/O cover. I've specifically left the CPU cover off at the back to try and give you an idea. But also, it's got this weird hole here. It's almost like that the I/O cover's going to be used on maybe a board later on that's got a bigger heat sink that goes through or something. I just don't understand what the big gap there is. Now we've got two fan headers up here for the CPU and the CPU optional. You've got two USB 3s down this side. They're vertical, not horizontal. SATA wise, there's 10 of them in total down the side. We've got another fan header here though. There's another one down at the bottom of the board here as well. There's not an absolute plethora of fan headers, if I'm honest. Something that there is quite a few of. You've got two RGB connectors down at the bottom of the board here, two totally separate ones. And then there's another RGB connector up here for if you're running one of the AMD RGB OEM coolers. I would say though that I think having a RGB in the middle of the motherboard is a bit of a mistake. I think it would have been better up here, out the way a little bit somewhere. You do get two M.2 slots. There's one there where you can see I've got one fitted, and then there's another one down here. And if we had the board powered up, which I don't, the only place that you get lights is around this chipset here. Now with a graphics card in like this, it's literally just, you're going to see a little bit around the bottom. So lighting on it, not so much. Some people will say I prefer it without lighting, but if you prefer it without lighting, you can just kind of turn it off. Some people will say then, but it's going to save me money, but it's not the cheapest board in the world because they do come in at £225. The pattern might not please everyone either, but as you can see, once you've got your graphics card in there, it does cover up most of the cogs. The bulk of the cogs are all going to be around the graphics card area. So once you do have your graphics card in there, as I've just shown you, it does cover most of them up. You can do crossfire and SLI if you want, and there's a decent, you do get a half decent slot through here. You get a good solid slot. They're not sandwiched together. Now, a lot of people do seem to be asking me about the AM4 mount and can you use it with AM3 coolers. Not with this one. The only way that you can use your older AM3 cooler is if you use the little clips and use basically the stock mount with the little tabs that you screw on. If you use those ones, then yes, you can use your older cooler on it. And that's one of the reasons why we've been using the Corsair H110. And that's just because we can use those tabs and it means that it's backwards compatible. So yes, there's lots going on the board, but does that then translate into lots of performance? Okay then peeps, so down to the nitty gritty. Now we do need to clarify a few points, so please just bear with me while I tell you all of these, because then if there are any questions that come out of the data that I'm going to give you and my thoughts about stuff, I'm hoping to have covered everything for you straight off the bat. Now, first things first, when I first got the board, it came to me, even though we're quite a bit after launch, with a V1.4 BIOS on it. Now I've seen mentioned online that there was at least a V1.6 and a V1.8 BIOS available, although when I went to the ASRock website to have a look, there was a V2, so V2.0. Now the problem was the V1.4 BIOS actually didn't let you update the BIOS at all. The option in the BIOS was totally missing, which, you know, made things rather difficult. So I then had to go to ASRock, explain the situation. Apparently it was a known problem, and they then sent me an exe file which I had to run in DOS to flash the BIOS. But the problem was that wasn't on their website. Thankfully now I can tell you that they are putting the DOS files up there, so the EXEs, and the normal files that you can use on a USB stick to flash from within the BIOS. They're just to be clear as well, there is a tool that runs in Windows that can pick up BIOS updates and do it for you. But even though I did try that as a last resort, it wasn't picking up any possible BIOS updates. So yeah, in the end, I had to do it with DOS to flash it through. The BIOS that ASRock sent me was V2.2. So I got that on there and I did my testing. I have to admit it was a bit flaky. If for argument's sake, if you had an overclock and you were running some benchmarks in Windows and it was unstable, rather than just like restarting or switching off, it would actually go 00 on the PCI poster on the board. And then I was finding I was getting some problems where I wasn't then able to ever get the rig started again. There was a few little glitchy things like that. It really genuinely did seem to be fighting against me. We spent a lot of time going through possible different options, looking at certain things, blah blah blah. Yes, it was challenging to say the least. We've now got V2.3 on there. That has made some things a little bit easier to work with, and you know, a little bit quicker. It seems to be another thing it seems to be doing is running a bit cooler as well. And the weird thing is I say it's running a bit cooler, but it's actually running a bit cooler, and that was on a warmer day, so the ambient temperatures in the room were slightly warmer. But whatever they've done in the BIOS, they have made some progress, for want of a better term. Now, when with the ASRock, you've obviously got the clock generator on it, which allows us to tweak the base clock. Now, when you tweak the base clock, that does then overclock the PCI Express, which then in turn, because you're overclocking the PCI Express, that's going to affect graphics, that's going to affect your M.2 drives, and they even do say if you're, make sure that you've got your operating system on the M.2 before you start overclocking the PCI Express. I know it's, you know, unlikely that you'd be overclocking without having an OS on, but it's something that they say because you may not get an OS on it again. I don't know whether that means if you need to upgrade Windows, you need to go back to stock or something like that. But it's something to keep in mind. And I know, because I've spent a lot of time working with the CPU, I know what I can do with the CPU, and I know what's capable to eke from it. For example, I know I can get 4.1 gigahertz bench stable with relatively okay volts. It's below 1.45. I know we can easily get 3200 megahertz running on it. I also know that I can push kind of the memory on as well if you've got the right board and that sort of thing. And I also know, and this is with the point that I'm trying to get to, is I also know that she's got 125 base clock in her, because I've had it tested I've done 125 base clock with another board. And the weird thing is I did 125 base clock with multiplier and memory all running in. So we were basically running 4.1 gigahertz with 3350 megahertz memory and that 25 base clock all tied in. So I know she's fairly capable. It's obviously not a golden chip or anything like that, but I'm telling all this because of the information you're going to get now. So I'm just trying to you know, kind of lay the setting or whatever it's called. I'm just trying to make the scene, and then we'll start talking about what we're going to do now. So what I did end up doing is I did go looking for base clock and possible memory tie-ins. And weirdly, I did seem to hit the same wall continuously. Now, when you play it in the BIOS and you're changing the base clock, if you change the base clock, the memory is going to change, and so is your clock speed. So what we genuinely do when we're running to do base clock tests is we'll keep the multiplier for the memory and the CPU down as low as possible and try to push the base clock up. So that's the only thing we're overclocking. And then you go back later and then you try and see how high you can get the memory and see how high you can get it all to tie in. Well, weirdly, I seem to be constantly hitting a wall above 112 base clock. So if I had 112 base clock, I could get it tied in with memory really, really nicely. I could get it, the CPU, it came up, you know, the actual CPU multiplier would come up, but not as much as I may have expected. But 113 base clock, literally, as soon as I tried dialing in 113 base clock, it would crash to the point where I would have to clear the BIOS entirely and then start again. There was never, once I'd done 113, there was never any way back from that. I did think it might have been a funny divider or something like that, so I tried 115 base clock. Same thing, I tried a number of different memory dividers, running the memory a little bit quicker, maybe running the CPU a little bit quicker to see whether it, it was just a funny divider, and I never ever managed to get it to go above. But this is one of the weird things that I do want to stress now, is at 112 base clock, I did manage to get 3,580 megahertz. Now that was just a screenshot. I have to stress that, was just a screenshot, but it is the fastest memory that I've ever seen running on my chip. I have not been able to replicate that on any of the other clock generated boards either. But I do need to kind of stress that as soon as we went above sort of like 3,250 megahertz on the memory, it did start to get shaky, and you could get them to kind of come in around the 3.3 sort of mark with stability, although it could be a bit hit and miss. It was a bit of a strange one. Sometimes a benchmark would crash entirely, you'd restart it and run it again and it would be totally fine. It was quite glitchy. Anyway, so we did manage to get some monstrous memory running on it. Sadly, it wasn't like completely usable though. But like I said, it does show a fair indicator of what it may be possible with some BIOS tweaks, and their engineers spend a little bit more time on it. The overclock that we ended up going for in the end was 105 times 38.75, and that's with the GPUs as given those sort of the divider for us there, and that gave us just shy, so it's basically it's a quarter of a notch below 4.1 gigahertz. So it reads on CPU-Z as being 4068.29, but it's basically 4075 if you were to take the extra point in on the, because it says 104.99. If it was 105 dead, it would all kind of be nice round numbers. And then with the memory, we were running over 3.3, and like I said, with the over 3.3, sometimes the benchmarks randomly, for argument's sake, like PC Mark 8, it crashed on us once. I restarted it and then I ran it again, and then it seemed to be okay, and that was seemed kind of consistent with quite a lot of the benchmarks that we were doing. Now, one thing I will say is CPU-Z with the board is not running or showing the right voltages. They look like they're mental, they're not. I never go above 1.45 volts. This was at 1.45 volts. One thing I will say on this though is you do genuinely need to watch your SoC volts. You don't want your SoC volts going over 1.2 volts really. Certainly not if you're running 3200 megahertz memory or below, and it has a habit of running them a bit too high is probably the best way I can put it. Keep an eye on it with something like Hardware Monitor, and I did also notice that the load line calibrations in the BIOS are set to level 5, which are always set to overvolt. I turned my SoC and my CPU load line calibration down to level 3, and that kept me on a relatively even keel. So they were being set at level 5 to go above straight out of the box. So I would give those a watch, and I would also make sure with your SoC volts that you keep them down as low as possible. Don't just go and put 1.2 in and leave it, because adding volts does mean increasing temps. So it's always worth keeping all these different points in mind. So we got an okay clock out of it. It probably wasn't as good as I was hoping. I was hoping for that extra quarter to be able to bring it up to the 4.1 really. And to be honest with you, the 104 base clock was a bit low as well. I did try and eke it up and be able to play with the multipliers, but this genuinely seemed to be the most stable out of all the options that I had. But we got above 3200 megahertz memory, so we run that. And then we run that, and then that also, you know, so that gives us an ability to show that you can run the memory a little bit higher. But you'll see in a minute, running the base clock slightly higher, because it does turn the PCI Express bandwidth from PCI Express 3 down to PCI Express 2. When you do make these changes, you'll see that it may not be the best idea if you're gaming, and we'll cover all these kind of points in the conclusion. So we have lots of results for you to talk about, graphs and performance and all of that sort of thing. So I have to say to you right now that if you want to go and have a look on the OC3D website, we have all of the graphs there, bigger breakdown with lots more results, lots more tests that we've run. And like I said, we've had this in the test bench now for over a week, because we've been messing around with different BIOSes and having to go backwards and forwards from ASRock, waiting for BIOS and all that sort of stuff. So it's well worth going and have a look at all the other results. So the results themselves, they are a mixed bag. So what I am going to do is I'm going to show you both sides of the coin, because there are two sides to the coin. And then what we will do is calm your jets. We're going to get to the conclusion. We're going to pick it apart. We're going to have a good old chat about it, and I'm going to discuss my thoughts on, you know, what's going on and the state of affairs and how I feel about the board and the performance. So X265 benchmark. The X265, it did really well. It's a good processing benchmark. Actually, it works quite well with stability as well. You can see it come in at second place here. The difference between these as well, say for argument's sake, the top two, you do need to remember the crosshair was when we were we reviewed that quite soon after launch. So ASRock have had a fair bit of time with the BIOS with this, but then we do need to think about a geezer. So that's something else that we're going to pick up in the conclusion. So it did relatively well in that. When we look at Cinebench, this is the multi-threaded version, and it didn't respond very well to the overclock at all. Which was kind of weird, because when you go on to the single-threaded version, it topped the graph. Again, this is kind of strange, but it is leading me to think BIOS, because the BIOS is going to be the only thing that's going to be helping those cores talk to each other and all of that sort of thing. So single-threaded, it works really well. Multi-threaded, strangely, with Cinebench, it didn't really respond that well to it. IDA CPU benchmarks, absolutely loved, and as you can see, with it topped the stocks, it topped the overclocks. So with CPU intensive stuff, it did really well. So that's kind of showing you that the memory and the base clock is kind of working in nice and well there. It's definitely not something that I would be particularly worried about on the BIOS updates, apart from when you think about it, if you have a look in and look a little bit closer, the PhotoWorks result, for example, was not quite as good as all of the other ones. Now, PC Mark 8. PC Mark 8 is where the turning point comes and we go to the other side of the fence. It didn't do that well in the overclocks, and it didn't do that well with the stock really either. I mean, it's not really that much quicker than a B350 board, although there's not a lot to pick between them. And then we get to the point where I was trying to get to you before about the PCI Express 2 and the PCI Express 3. The gaming results, it didn't do as well as the Crosshair, for example. And you also need to think about, we would have been running newer NVIDIA drivers on this, so technically they should have been running better. To stop people thinking maybe the GPU drivers were worse, I actually, when I saw these results coming out, I then went back, rolled the driver back and installed the other one, the older one. And I did that after doing a display driver uninstaller run as well, where it was a complete clean sweep and started again. And we got the near enough the same scores out of it again as well. And it was pretty much, when we went on to 3D Mark, 3D Mark was a little bit even more disappointing. So, we will talk. So, it was a mixed bag. One thing I will say though is I've spoken to a few BIOS engineers about all this AGESA stuff with AMD, and they do say that when the AGESA updates keep coming out, it's essentially like them having to almost start with the BIOS again. Some of them are finding their feet in updating them a little bit quicker. And all these AGESA updates, by the way, they're to help with memory compatibility, because all of the memory compatibility problems at the moment come down to AMD, not the motherboard menus really, because the AMD have to do all the memory qualifications and get everything set up, and then they pretty much make a code package up, send it to the motherboard devs, and then that has to get implemented in the BIOS. And that's so, for argument's sake, when you put your memory stick in, it will work for starters, because some memory kits out there, you put them in and they will never start. And that's not because your board's broken, it's just because you've got the wrong memory kit. The other thing that can be is you can get them to run at stock, so when you just fit them and they work, they're not running at their rated speed at that. Some of them will do that, and then when you try and XMP them, or whatever the manufacturer's calling it, to try and get them run at their actual rated speed, sometimes they're not working at all. There can be a bit of a workaround with that, where you can set them up manually, and it can be a bit of a weird backdoor to get your memory running. But anyway, so my point with this is the V2.2 was their AGESA update BIOS. And then what they then did with the V2.3 is that was to help try and bring the overclocking in, and those updates come out quite close together as well. So I think that they are still working on this. And to be fair, I do think that the whole Ryzen platform at the moment, we're all being used in like a live beta test, because when it came out, it didn't feel finished. All of these constant updates that are coming out at the moment, I don't think it's particularly finished. I genuinely do think they are fixing problems as they're going along, rather than having done them before it came out. I've never known this many BIOS updates, and specifically issues that link directly back to the CPU and chipset manufacturer, rather than it being an individual motherboard vendor's issue. I remember one time when we had it from the blue side of the camp, and there was an update with the management engine that they used, and we did have a single kind of like a couple of 3 week step back with BIOS updates, but then that was it. And the fact it's still ongoing, I'm really not kind of that happy about it. And it's a shame that we got pushed so hard to do the review so quickly, because I think if I went back now, I would probably be saying, things a little bit more with a frown and unhappy. So the point is yes, it is a mixed bag. One thing that I can say to you though is a lot of this could be down to a specific sort of BIOS. So I know there has been people out there that have had great success overclocking on some of the older BIOSes, or maybe know the BIOS is slightly better, and how to work with their quirks. But with the V22 and the V23, I have to admit it did feel like it was a lot more effort than it necessarily needed to be or has been with the other vendors. And when I say the other vendors, I do mean Gigabyte, Asus and MSI. So the big three, for want of a better term. So, but the one thing I will say is I do think that Ryzen across the board for all of the vendors is something where we are having to stay on top of our BIOS updates. That's just something we're going to have to get used to as enthusiasts. Now the memory support on it was obviously very good. I obviously couldn't get any like crazy stable, and I was hoping to be able to do gaming results and that sort of thing. But this was the other really weird thing about it, is when we did play with that base clock, it did then drop our gaming results right down. Might have been because we didn't get enough base clock out of it to kind of offset the PCI Express to PCI Express 3 drop. But so one thing I would say is if you're looking at this as a gaming rig and you just want to set it up, have a decent CPU overclock and you're going to game on it, I would say leave the base clock alone. I would say 3200 megahertz is ample for these, because you do need to think about that if you are with all of the other boards that haven't got a clock generator. AMD are capping the 3200 megahertz at the moment. Don't know why, but anyway, and I think it's a kind of good stop-off point as well, because pushing beyond that point, you're either overclocking the kits that you buy, and you're then obviously never going to be limited. You could be limited by how much your sticks can actually overclock. Whereas when I was pushing these, like really pushing mine, I was running kits that were 3600 or 3866, so I knew I had an awful lot of headroom. So I knew that when I did eventually hit a wall and I couldn't get above it, I knew it wasn't the memory's fault. I knew it was settings and stuff that I need to play around with the board. So deep breaths, good things to say. Voltage stability is great. One of the things I will say against Asus is they're still working in a really weird kind of constant P state overclocking, weird offsetty type, haven't got a clue why they're doing it way, in that you set a voltage and it always seems to go above, even if you near enough have to turn the load line calibration off. I was seeing with the Asus boards as well, I was seeing that you'd set, for argument's sake, 3.8 gigahertz, and then you turn around and it would be trying to run it at 4 gigahertz, and it was always kind of fluctuating all over the place. But the worst thing was the fact that their volts never stayed where you wanted them. They always seemed to. As soon as you put load on it, they would go right up. And that, like I said, that would have been even if the load line calibration was on a low setting. I have said to them about it. They've said, oh, it's all to do with offsets. And it's like, right, we'll just sort it out. Everybody else is fine and theirs isn't. This, absolutely fine. Brilliant. Apart from the fact that the only place that I could get decent readings was OCCT, which is a stress test tool, because all of the other programs were not reading it correctly. OCCT did seem to be able to cope with it okay, and I was getting to the point where, like I said, if I was to go into the BIOS and set 1.4, I would then go and have a look at OCCT and it would be 1.395, for example, and if I set it to 1.45, it was then showing 1.495. I'm getting confused now. You get what I'm trying to say? Please, yes, just nod. You know what I'm saying? It was just a little bit below. And if I played with load line calibration, if it was on level 5, you'd see that voltage fluctuate, but just a little bit. So that was why I turned the load line calibration down. But anyway, the point I'm trying to get at is the volts can be really good, but you do need to manually set your CPU volts and keep an eye on that SoC volts. One thing I did notice with the V2.3 BIOS as well, as I'd swear the temps went down a little bit. I'm not sure whether I've seen far too many results in the last week or so, because I've been doing this kind of on and off and trying to get things working properly. I genuinely spent a lot of time trying to tweak and get the better of this. I do think that the temps dropped. I don't know for whatever reason. The only thing I would say about the board as well is there isn't a temperature probe around the MOSFET area at all, and it doesn't pick up in any of the softwares. In that it would be, you can always see with the MOSFET temperature because it should be quite warm. But the reason why I'm saying this is because, and the reason why I ended up going looking for it, is despite the fact that we have 16 phases around that CPU, I think it's 12 for the CPU and 4 for the SoC, they do still get really warm. The chokes get hot to touch, and the heat sinks, you can feel that they are very warm as well. So despite the fact that there's loads of them, they do still seem to be getting stressed quite a bit, to the point that when I was running my absolute balls to the wall overclocks, I had a fan pushed over the top to help keep them cool. And it would have made me feel a lot easier if I'd had a thermal probe that I could have looked at in the softwares, to be able to see what the temperatures were. So I went with the fan just to make sure that there was absolutely no possibility of any instability of being temperature related. But the fact that they were getting warm when there were so many of them was kind of confusing to me, because if there's more, you'd think that they'd be sharing the load and they wouldn't be getting stressed as much. But this is the other point that I want to get to, is that even though we have all of those extra power phases, it still didn't manage for us to be able to get any better kind of overclocks. The fact that I wasn't even with 100 base clock and low memory being able to get a 4.1 gigahertz overclock, I found a little bit disappointing, if I'm honest. The Gigabyte Gaming 5 that I reviewed right at launch, you know, like very, very early on, 4.1 gigahertz. Were we doing 30? Yeah, we got 3200 megahertz memory. I'm actually trying to remember back. I've done too many things, but that did really, really well with 4.1, and I felt a bit kind of disappointed that this one didn't. Again, though, could we be blaming that on a geezer? There's lots of different kind of ways that you can swing with it. Something else was it's something that we get used to. But with expensive boards, you generally open the box, you've got your motherboard, and then you get the second layer, and then there's loads of stuff and goodies in there. With this, other than your Wi-Fi antennas for the back and a couple of SATA cables, it all felt a bit sparse. Genuinely, when I got it, it was like it had turned up in a B350 box, because you had the expensive Taichi on the top and then nothing underneath. Something else that I've got used to with all of the brands is, yes, you get a driver CD and there's 1,000,001 things on there that you can install. So many bits of software that they've done to be able to help you do this, and maybe you want to stream that, or maybe you want to, you know, there's loads of things on there. I am one of those people that looks at that, puts it in the box, downloads all the latest drivers from the website and ignores everything that's kind of in the box. But when you get a board that does cost quite a bit and it doesn't come with any of it, and it feels like you've bought a product that should have been £100 cheaper, it kind of made me kind of scratch my head a little bit. The other thing as well, and it's I have to pick up all these things because you need to think that it's not necessarily my opinion, but I have to try and cover as many points as I can. And it did feel a bit sparse on the possible lighting front. There was a few around the chipset, but there wasn't anything else going on. So if you're looking for a plain board, brilliant. But it wouldn't hurt if it had the RGBs or the LEDs in other places, and then you could just turn them off. There's a lot of people that are now saying to the screen, but if it hasn't got the RGBs and all the LEDs and all that sort of stuff, it means it's going to save us money. But it's not exactly the cheapest board either, is it? Now, the other thing was it did feel to me that it was kind of fighting me and stuff. There's maybe people that are saying it's just because you're not talented enough. Well, if it does come to that, I'll take that badge and I'll wear it. But I'll take that badge and I'll wear it, and I'll go and get another board that doesn't make me feel like a bit of a dunce, really. So there are lots of things that you can do on here, like you can really play around with all the P states and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff that you can really get to grips with. I'll tell you something else that I did get to as well, and it wound me up a bit. When I get a manual from another manufacturer, you get a big fat manual, and it tells you so much in there. It's like your Bible, and I know as men we're not meant to use them, but it tells you everything. For argument's sake, you have the PCI poster on the bottom of the board. If you get a freeze with one of the other manufacturers, you go through your manual, and then you go and look up what that number is, and you can try and work it out. 55 is normally memory, for example. So you can go in and work out what it is. So you can possibly kind of fault find what's going on. Well, the first time I started getting freezes on this when I was overclocking, I went to the manual and I looked at it, and there are about 5 or 6 pages out of a big thick book that are in English, and then it repeats the same thing in about 7 different languages. But then there's nothing else to kind of help you at all. And I do think that if that's the way you're going to go, you need a big fat manual, at least on a driver CD or somewhere that people can go and get help with, because the manual specifically was something I was a bit like, so it all just felt a bit kind of, I don't know, like it was unfinished is the best way I can put it. So I'm going to, essentially we need to kind of wrap this all up. It has been a mixed bag of tricks. The reason why I got this board in the first place is everyone was going on to me about the Taichi in the YouTube video comments. So I got hold of ASRock and I got a board here. Now I can say it is a good board. I do think though that a lot of you out there have overhyped it a bit though, because I don't think it's as capable as you may first have been thinking. Now, there are obviously going to be people out there that have got it and have done wonders with it, and you know, congratulations to you. But on the grand scheme of things, there are a lot of things that do feel either a bit unfinished, or there are things that are just not being utilised properly. I do hope that this all comes down to BIOS and they do get to fix it though. But my overwhelming feeling of this is a tweaker's board. It genuinely reminds me of working with some of the old DFI boards in the past, where there's lots of things that you can play with, but you're constantly having to update BIOS and then roll BIOS back because the new one's not so good, and there's all that kind of thing. But when you there are some things where in some of the benchmarks, as I've shown you, it does excel. But then there are some things that if you go through all of the results on the OC3D website, it doesn't do that well in either. There are areas where, like I said, I thought we were going to get slightly better overclocks with it. I think, you know, maybe I'm being a bit harsh, but the thing that I'm kind of, the boiling point that I'm trying to get down to is there is no absolute certainty. Is this the best board? Some things it is really good at, and then some things it's not so good at either. And like I said, with like the box and that sort of thing, it doesn't necessarily make you feel like it's a premium product. There's loads of power phases around the CPU. It makes it look expensive, but it doesn't really get you anywhere with it either. It's kind of an overbuilt board, and then the problem with it at the moment I would probably put down to BIOS. I'd love to come back to it in 3 or 4 months and they've absolutely knocked it out of the park. But at the moment, if you're going to buy it at the moment, I would genuinely say that you're probably buying it because you're absolutely hell-bent that you don't want to buy one of the other boards. As far as like the voltage stability and all that sort of stuff, at one point I would have turned around to you and said, absolutely, if you're going for that, you want to go and pick this board. But sadly, they've now ruined that with BIOS. And then the Asus ones are still all kind of all over the place. So it does have its positive points there. But anyway, award. We're going to give it the Enthusiast award because, to be honest with you, as far as the Enthusiast award's concerned, it's one of those products that you just kind of get because you want it. Now, I don't think I'm going to be talking many people out of getting this board. I think a lot of people are going to be watching this because they've either already bought it and they're looking for me to validate their purchase, or they're looking at this board so that they can go and tell all their mates that have bought other brands that they've done the wrong thing. But the weird thing is, in some ways they might have done and you might be able to go and kick them in the gonads, and then in other ways they won't. And the worst bit about it is in a month's time it's probably all going to be utterly irrelevant. So should you buy it? That's really going to come down to you. I'm not ever going to tell you that you absolutely must go and buy something. But the one thing I will say is if you get it with the BIOS version that I've got on the moment, Don't expect it to be a quick process if you know what you're looking for. But the best part of it is, if you're looking for something to get your teeth into, you want to learn, you understand that things are going to adapt and evolve and you are going to have to tweak about with it. It's almost like owning a classic car. Then yes, then we do get to the point that it can be interesting. It's going to give you something to do at the weekends. It's going to give you something that you're going to be playing around with quite a bit. But the one thing I will say is, you want to buy it as a gaming rig, leave the base clock alone. Just get your memory at 3200 megahertz. They do seem to be working better with Corsair now. G-Skill Trident Z has been pretty faultless with all of the BIOSes, so that's something to keep in mind. But I have had multiple Corsair and Kingston kits running in this board in the last week, because I've gone through endless amounts of stuff to try and get there and, you know, find all these things out for you. So yes, there has been a lot of talking. There is no absolute clear answer either way. If you're looking for an easy board to live with and you just want to click and forget and all of that sort of stuff, I'd probably say that you probably are better off getting something like a B350 board rather than paying for something this expensive, because despite it being this expensive, you can get the same kind of numbers out of the cheaper boards. So this really is a tweaker's board, someone that wants to mess around, someone that wants to play. But the one thing I would do, if I was you, I would save yourself get a safe overclock setup. I would get it saved and then I would export it onto a USB stick, so that if you do mess around with it at the weekend and it does all go bandy and you have to completely clear the BIOS and you lose everything, you've still got that safe one that you can go in, load up, get all your gaming sort of settings back. So I don't know, you're running 3.8, 4 gigahertz on whatever processor that you've got, 3200 megahertz memory, all the hardware with the volts has already been done, and you can get yourself up and running again in about 5 minutes rather than having to go back to absolute scratch. So if you do have any questions about this board specifically, maybe you've owned it, thinking about owning it, go to the Overclock 3D website and ask the questions on the forums, because it's a lot easier for me to track our conversations than trying to do it on YouTube. And I'm getting so many like comments and stuff on YouTube now. The replies just get lost in the update feedy tab thing that goes down the side. So if you do want, you know, specific help, I will answer on the forum threads for you. I now need to drink water because my mouth has gone fairly dry. I know that I have given you both good and bad sides of the fence, but that was because, let's face it, that's what I'm here for. I'm not here to just tell you it's amazing. I'm not also here just to tell you that it's not amazing. So hopefully I found the balance for you and I've explained it in a way that has suited you. Right, this has been Tiny Tom Logan with his first ASRock review. We will see if it's the last one. Anyway, out.